And hi everyone, it's Simon Ammons again here with Technical Writer HQ. Today with us we have Erin Cochran. Am I saying the last name
Yeah,
right?
you got
Okay,
it.
with us today, and she's going to tell us all about her views about technical writing, how she upskill and upleveled her game when it came to delivering technical writing content. So we're going to get right into it. Erin, introduce yourself to us. Tell us your academic background and how you got started in technical writing.
Sure. So in high school, I knew I wanted to be a writer. I was so sure of it. And at the time, I thought, hey, I'm going to go into journalism. I am so interested in investigating things and like picking stuff apart and putting it back together. And then I got to college in a professional writing program and I started my classes and I realized that I really didn't like journalism. So I had to completely like change what I was doing. I didn't change
Yeah.
my major, but I took a technical writing class, I think my junior or senior year, and I just
Oh,
absolutely fell
nice.
in love with it. It was something that came very naturally to me as somebody who is very curious and again likes to take stuff apart and put it back together. And I've just been doing it ever since then.
I love that. I love that. You said something interesting. You said taking stuff apart and putting it back
Mhm.
together. When
Yeah.
it comes to documentation, what are you pulling apart? Like where do you go find those things to pull apart? And then how do you build it back? Like what's your strategy there?
Oh, sure. So I guess I want to start like way, way back and tell you where this love came from
Okay.
first.
Okay, good, good.
Um, in the early ages of the internet, like so early 2000s, that tells you how old I am. Everybody had their own GeoCities, everybody built their own websites, and I taught myself to code by looking at people's source code. So that was like when I started pulling code apart, figuring out what it did, tinkering with it, and then putting it back together. And I apply that kind of same um, dig deep and play around to documentation. So when I landed my actual second tech writing job, which is like kind of where things really took off. We'll
Yeah.
talk about that later. I I taught myself everything about databases and APIs because when I started, I knew nothing. So at the time, I started diving into the source code to like teaching myself to read different languages, even if I couldn't code in them. And then I would have something to go back to the engineers with and ask very pointed questions. So it was explained like me figuring out and playing with like an API, for example, and
Mhm.
figuring out how it worked and how users might want to use it and then going back to an engineer and having them explain it back to me and like fill in the gaps.
I love that. I love that. Because on your profile, you also talked about learning SQL and the other
Yep.
resources. So you're saying API, source code, going into that depth. What attracted you to like get so deep so early into your career? What was that thing for you?
Oh my goodness. Well, at the time, I was in completely over my head, being like, I have no idea what an API is or what a database or any of that stuff is. Like I had started in the data industry at the time, knew nothing. And I was like, well, I have to learn or I'm not going to be able to keep up.
Right.
So when I started doing that, my documentation, like the documentation I was able to write also got better. Because I was getting onto the same level as the end user who was going to be using my documentation. And by doing that, I was able to serve them better.
I love that. I love that. Another quote that we talked about before you got in the call, you talked about that the best documentation isn't siloed or opaque, but it is written by a community for a community. So for you as a coming into that community, you learned what they learned, you saw what they saw, you wrote what they saw so that you could write something that they could actually understand. Walk us through that process, that community written by a community for a community. Tell us more about that.
Sure. So I have worked at two jobs now where we accept contributions from people like outside the team. At the first job, which was at RJ Metrics slash Stitch, I actually opened up our internal repo to allow people internally to contribute directly. Like I still had to approve everything and like read
Right.
through it, but people made suggestions on their own. And that was great because they knew things that I didn't or wasn't always aware of. Like, for example, things might have come up on support that
Hmm.
I didn't know about or we didn't realize was a thing while we were writing the docs. And instead of waiting on me to go ahead and make those updates, support could just go ahead and do it or clarify things like that customers might have seen in the docs that weren't totally clear. Like we wrote it one way thinking this would be great, but then in practice it turned out to be something different.
Yeah.
That was fine.
Yeah.
At Dagster Labs, where I am now, our entire repo is open source, so anybody can contribute at any time. Like, we obviously still have to review and approve things, but people propose doc changes all the time, several times a week at least. And by doing that, I have a better idea of what's missing for our customers, what they're not getting, and what more of what they would like to see.
So opening your doors, I guess, to
Yeah.
like having everybody, is it scary a little bit because then you're getting different styles, different writing levels, different grammar with you said your journalism and English background. How do you balance the tsunami with, but we need to like stick to like a voice, a brand, a style? How do you manage those sides?
That's a very, very good question. And I will admit that my answer is not perfect. Right now, it's not scalable at the moment. Like, I have to touch everything manually, but it's okay for the time being. I'm looking at adding tooling that will make this a bit easier for not only me to keep up with stuff, but make it easier for people to contribute. For example, there are tools like Veil Server, which is a grammar and style linter that people can use, and it runs in their CI or their tests when they're building their docs. So that could check for things like, do your headings in your pull request, for example, like match our style guide? Does it catch grammar issues? Things like that kind of can eat up and go back, cause like a lot of ping ponging in a PR review. But the rise of AI is also going to give us the ability to look at things like, can you rewrite this a little bit in the defined voice and style that we have, and make that a little bit easier for people to actually hammer stuff out before they give it to me. So I still plan on reviewing as much as possible. I prefer to be a benevolent dictator when it comes to docs. So, but I want to make sure that people are empowered and they feel good about the changes that they're making, and it's not a struggle to do it.
Benevolent dictator. Okay. Because I noticed that you said you actually like on your own decided to create a platform where there's this cross back and forth contribution. So what made you want to even do that? Like you I mean, especially coming from an English journalism background, like the standards are structured and you're like, the hell with it, I want to open the floodgates. Like, what was it? Just your content was stagnating? Was it because you wanted people to feel more secure in the content that was being generated? Like, what made
all
you do that?
all really good questions, and I will admit that initially the reasons were selfish. It was a couple things. Like, initially when I started at RJ Metrics and Stitch, all of our docs were hosted on Zendesk, and for me personally, that's just not the right tool for what we were doing. Like, there were a lot of people on our support team and and in sales and stuff, and they could go in and make changes to the docs, but I couldn't see who changed what and when or why. There was no context, and it was really difficult to be able to get a handle on things without having information. So I started looking at Docs' code to be able to kind of give me the stuff I needed to actually create a better platform, create better docs, and manage things more holistically. And I admittedly was also curious. It involved like me dealing with something that I had never dealt with before. I knew a little bit about web development and HTML, but I hadn't done it in years. So I had to go and like teach myself how to use these tools. The tool of choice at the time was Jekyll, which is Ruby based. And I taught myself how to code an entire site, how to deploy it, and how to manage that going forward. And there were just benefits that came along for the ride. Not only did we have tighter control over our content and we could see who contributed what, when, and why, but it also meant that we could open things up to external contributors and still maintain like the integrity of our docs.
I love it. I love it. So you introduced something it's a perfect segue, docs as code. So I'm an engineer, but I'm not a software engineer. I'm not a developer. I'm not a coder.
Yep.
When I think of code, I think of lines and lines and lines of text and numbers or whatever. When I think of documentation, I think of beautiful paragraphs, SOPs, structures, you know what I mean? And so for me, I'm having like, conniption fit trying to get docs as code. Can you help us like understand what that means in real life?
Yeah, absolutely. And just like you, I don't have an engineering background. Everything I know is completely self-taught. I'm a tinkerer, complete amateur, and I just enjoy learning things. So we are on the same level there. No
There you
worries.
go.
But there are a couple components to this. So docs as code doesn't necessarily mean that you write your docs as like what you would think of as traditional code, like Python or C or
Right.
anything like that. Um, but it basically means that you're applying engineering best practices and workflows to your documentation. You're treating it like a product. So that means that it's checked into a repo. We use Git for ours, so we're able to track things and collaborate on them. We test our docs using a CI/CD pipeline, and we use tools to also help us manage the deployment of our docs. Versus something like Zendesk, which is just an all-in-one baked solution. Everything is just GUI or web browser based interface. It's not managed like code. You write things into a text box like you would in Microsoft Word, and that's it. And also, disclaimer, I haven't used Zendesk in years. So if that's wrong, sorry. But that's what I remember of it. This is basically giving you more custom control and additional tools to be able to create a documentation platform using documentation and engineering best practices.
I love that. I love that because even I mean you mentioned Microsoft Word, Office. I'm a Microsoft baby, and I mean Google whatever. I struggle with the what do you call it, the track changes, the revision history, the
Yes.
well, who did
Yes.
what, when did they do it, like how did they do it, like did y'all call me, like what's going on? So I love how you're saying like engineering best practices, you're merging that into the content itself. So then when you do you then how do you like do you do release notes, do you how do you handle then the version control, like when you have so many sources of content coming in, how do you like manage that and marry that for like a seamless like final document?
Sure. Um, it can be difficult, I will say, especially when people are as enthused about contributing as some of the folks at Dagster Labs. All of the engineers help write documentation at Dagster Labs, for example. So it can be a lot, but it's also pretty great because everybody has like their own context and things and why they want to add that stuff to the docs. But luckily for us, we have a pretty solid release process that includes automatically generating release notes for every single pull
Mm,
request that goes into a repo.
mm,
And our docs are part of our mono repo, which includes it's basically alongside the code for the open source Dagster product. And that means that all of the documentation changes that go into that repo in a given week are compiled into our change log. So everything is already logged right there. Everybody's responsible for going through and adding notes about what they have changed and why. I proofread those, especially for the documentation side of things, but luckily it's mostly automated for us.
I love it. So what about the okay, so we're automating the documentation side. What about the new features? Do you all have this? And I know this is like heaven for some of us as technical writers, but is there a sync between when the new feature or new app or whatever is deployed and when the documentation about it gets released? Is there like a it happens instantaneously as well, or do you have that gap like most of us struggle with?
I think there's always going to be a little bit of a struggle here. I think it basically just comes down to how wide is that gap
Ah,
actually, because it's never going to be completely closed, right? It's just the nature of teams, especially like async teams who might want to work differently. Like one team works this way and another team works this way. Our team is pretty great at doing documentation alongside a feature that they are developing and looping me in to proofread stuff or write things as needed. So we're pretty okay there. I got to say that our rate for getting documentation outside along features, I would love it to be 100%, but it's not. It's pretty good though. Like we're
okay.
able to release that stuff either alongside a feature or in maybe next week's release, which is also pretty great. It gives us time to see how customers are using the thing, ask questions, and then make updates to those docs as needed.
Life goes as a
Yes,
technical writer.
yes.
So another thing that you mentioned before we got on the call, you talked about consolidating sources of documentation, not just from different users, engineers, the product managers, whatever, but you talked about, Google Drive, Gmail, and then people's brains. Okay, I was flat like when I read that part. Talk to me, people's brains. How do you copy and paste that info, that so necessary information into a document? Walk us through that.
Sure. So I touched on this a little bit before, which was basically like I didn't know anything when I started. I took stuff apart. I learned how things should work, basically. Like, let's use APIs as an example.
Yeah.
When I worked at Stitch, because we were a data integration platform, that meant that we had to touch many different sources like Salesforce, Facebook, etc. So I had to learn how different APIs worked and how we connected and like managed the data for each one of those things. And I found that there were projects, like plans that people would, like the project managers and stuff, would write, and it would cover the very basics of how they were going to go ahead and build the thing. But I knew, and I started to learn enough to be able to fill in what the user actually cared about, which were things like, how do I actually set this thing up? What permissions do I need to be able to do this? Do I need a certain type of plan to be able to like access the API for this integration and wind up using it? And all of that information lived inside the engineers' heads because they have to know that to be able to build it and test it. And by learning what questions to ask and pull that information out, challenged them to really think about documentation from the user perspective, which was, this is what the user cares about. Like, how you build the thing is kind of secondary to getting it set up. It's important for support to know that, to be able to troubleshoot, but ultimately a user doesn't care about it. They care about how you set this up and what their data looks like. And that was the information I learned to pull out of engineers. That's just one example, but
I love that because you're saying you have to ask, you found out, or you figured out what questions to ask, not just asking questions. Can you go into that a little bit more?
Sure. It's definitely a skill, and it's one that I have honed over years in my career. Before, like initially as a very young tech writer, I probably would have walked in and been like, just tell me about this thing that you're building. And I would have potentially accepted whatever was said at face value. I didn't know what I didn't know.
Right.
And part of that is me being young and not knowing, exactly how to approach this stuff. But also there's a bit of a communication gap between the person who builds and the person who uses, right? So by like actually going in and testing everything myself, I learned a lot. I think that's absolutely invaluable. If you have the ability to test and play with the thing that you're documenting, you should. And otherwise, be a complete pest and ask people questions and make them show you how to do stuff. That's what I did. I was annoying and I learned a lot.
So be annoying. I love it. So she said it first. Okay. Erin said be annoying.
Yeah, it's fine. I give you permission.
You give me permission. I also love how even when you describe docs as code, the engineering best practices, release notes, documented everything, who's writing what, writing about what. Like you have this continuous theme of solving your own problems, not waiting for somebody else to step in and tell you what this is. But you already know it's a problem, but you're taking this extra step to document it, to use tools. You said Zapier, like Jira tickets. What is that like creatively for you to like just kind of jump out there and not and really fix it yourself when you encounter that sort of problem?
Oh, sure. I find it immensely satisfying. One of the things that I absolutely love about being a documentarian is that not all of it involves writing. As you and probably everybody else knows, a tech writer wears many more hats than just writing. Writing is a little bit of a misnomer when it comes to our title. So I'm a writer. I build things. I research. I'm a project manager. I'm also a product manager because docs are a product. So I had to find ways to actually make our workflow not only visible, but scalable and accessible to other people. That meant making sure that things like tickets were linked and people who were working on stuff knew about them, but also just like making sure that it wasn't, a pain to maintain that stuff. I really wanted to make sure that I was building something that not only worked for me, but could work for the rest of my team or teammates, and especially would continue to function well after if I left a company, for example.
I love that. So just getting close to the end there. At the beginning, we talked about building things written by a community for a community.
Sure.
And you were saying through your entire career, you're not just I would say pillaging, but taking from the community, but you're actually enabling, empowering, your community where it lives your trends, your ideals, your strategy lives on after you like move on to a different part of that community. Why is that so important? And I love how you said writing is a misnomer. I love how you said that we're building writing the product, the written word is a product. What motivates you to be such a community builder in that sense, beyond just writing, developing code? What is that for you?
I gotta say that even though I am self-taught in many things, I definitely couldn't have learned half the stuff or even most of the things that I know if I hadn't had support. So therefore, to me, it's I want to make sure that I am giving back as much as I take or have taken. So for me, that's why it's important. I think that you can build the most incredible product in the world. It could change lives, right? But if you don't know how to use it and nobody knows how to access it, it's really not any good. And by making sure that we are community focused and giving and making sure like there's a balance between giving and taking, and users can tell you what they think and what they need, then we can create something better for everybody. And everybody, when you lift everybody up at the same time, like we're all better.
I love that. I love that. What do you say? What the rising tide
Rising
raises all
tide lifts
ships.
all boats.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. So in your career, you said as a new tech writer, now as a more seasoned tech writer, any tips, tricks, regrets, no regrets, things you wish you had done sooner? You want to share with our listeners?
Oh, there are many for sure. I taught myself to code, I think 3-4 years into my career. Like I wish I had learned about what the more popular languages were earlier in my career, so I could have like completed courses then, like Python, for example, or SQL. I didn't learn those until I was pretty far in. I didn't have to, but it definitely was helpful to be able to do that. The other thing is like, don't be afraid to get your hands dirty and be loud, be annoying. It's I definitely think you should. Documentation is really, really hard to get right. It's easy to get wrong, and it's really underappreciated. I think you have to be bullish about showing people and demonstrating your value, and you've got to be loud about it. So, yeah, you have to basically be your own advocate. That's a really important skill. That's an important skill for any career, but especially in something like this.
I love it. I love it. I love it. So we're getting down to the last few minutes here. So you talked about Jira, Trello, Salesforce, Zendesk. Any other writing tools per se that are your favorites? We just like to leave our listeners with some of your top software platforms.
I'm really big on Zapier. I've used it for so many things. It's been absolutely wonderful in automating workflows and making things easier for me. For a writing tool, I've been using Sublime Text Editor for years. It's really nice being able to install extensions. I may or may not be making the switch to VS Code soon, which is what many engineers use in-house here at Dagster Labs. It's extremely powerful, but also a little scary. I think that there's definitely a lot of good in something like that, though. If you're doing Docs as code and learning how to use something like that, it's extremely powerful.
I love it. I love it. Last words for our listeners before we close out today. Last words.
I'm just going to repeat myself. Like I said, be annoying. And I hope that people can, become their own advocates, because nobody else is really going to do it for you. You have to do it. And it just, good things will happen if you advocate for yourself, I promise.
Oh my goodness, Erin, thank you so much. You started with the community, you entered the community, built the community, took from the community, put back into the community. I know you're rising all ships and boats with what you're building.
Yep.
It is fabulous. It is fabulous. Erin, thank you so much for joining us today. I'll stay tuned next week. We will have another fabulous technical writer with us, use the word documentarian. I love that word. I need to change my title. I love that word because you're more than a writer. I love it. I love it. So once again, Erin, thank you so much, and everyone stay tuned for more of these episodes with Technical Writer HQ. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Erin.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.